And we have that.
I don't know what.
Okay, but then if I don't do it, what is broadcasting is where the camera's pointing, right? Instead of the people who are signing in.
Right.
Everybody.
Right.
Yeah, this is what's broadcast.
So no matter what's on the big screen,
He's doing great,
it's
but
because if Diane Kenny logs in, she becomes the big screen
you know, it is what it is.
But it is
For you,
Yeah.
for me.
but not for everybody.
Okay.
We miss them a lot.
Good morning. This morning we have Tammy Futrell from Washington Lee's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. What else?
Student engagement.
And student engagement.
This is-
This is part of a series of forums that we're doing around our welcoming process, our LGBTQ welcoming process. And in particular, to think about that part of welcoming that we may unconsciously being less welcoming than we intend to be because of bias or what are called microaggressions. So to try to understand how bias and microaggressions operate in our thinking and acting so that we can be more intentionally and openly welcoming to all people. James Keene was originally scheduled to make this presentation. We've rescheduled it several times. And James has not been able to do it for health reasons, but Tammy Futrell has from Washington Lee has agreed to make this presentation to us. And we're so glad and honored that she's here. So Tammy.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
As Tuck said, my name is Tammy Futrell, and this is my 20th academic year at Washington and Lee. I know. I know. Isn't that bananas? Like, I have conversations with the students now, and they're like, "You're older than my mom." You know, you could have kept that to yourself.
I would call that a microaggression.
That is a microaggression. Come on up. You want to Jake and Heidi left me out here by myself this morning, so you've got the language. I am going to talk to you this morning about bias, about microaggressions. It may not necessarily for every example that I give steer towards the LGBTQ community. I'm going to speak to you about experiences that I have had as a straight Christian Black woman, which will probably make your hair stand up too. But the concept of bias and microaggressions can be applicable across all identity groups. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about how our minds process information and then how that information is then turned into speech and behavior. And it influences and impacts how we engage with people or not engage with people, and in what ways we engage with people. So if you have questions, please, stop me. I want this to be more of a conversation. I know it doesn't look like that because I'm standing behind the podium, but I do want us to have a open conversation about this. No question, I'll tell you like I told the students, no question is stupid. Every question is important because I promise you, if you have a question, somebody else in the room has the exact same question. They just may not be courageous at that moment to ask it. And so they're probably like, oh, thank you. I was thinking the same thing. So I'll get started. The goals for our conversation to define implicit bias, to distinguish between implicit and explicit bias, to understand the ways in which implicit bias manifests itself in everyday life, to identify ways in which we can combat implicit bias, and to discuss the importance of implicit bias training and how it impacts systems, particularly church, because I see church as a system. For me, a system is a group of people that operate in such a way where there are policies, procedures, and we know that the church as a whole, any church has policies, procedures, and we'll talk about the ways that this type of training is important as we have those conversations. So, is everyone ready?
Is this training that you do or someone at Washington Lee does, or do you bring people in from outside to do this training at Washington Lee? You do it. Okay.
Shameless plug.
No, because
Shameless plug.
we might end up deciding we'd like to offer some training.
Yeah, this is one of my areas of expertise, anything having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do have people in my office that are kind of experts in like Jake Reeves, who is our LGBTQ plus educator, but we partner a lot on various aspects of identity, microaggression. I do conversations with our new employees. I do conversations with our students about being a good ally, about microaggressions, about implicit bias, how it impacts the workplace. Generational diversity, I do workshops about that. There at Washington and Lee, we have about 4 generations on our campus. Everything, we've got a couple baby boomers still left on campus. We've got the Gen Xers and all the way down to Gen Zers. And I promise you, I am feeling my Gen X-ness because,
Well, maybe sometime we can talk about training as well.
absolutely, yes.
But please
Yes.
continue with that.
Yes, absolutely. So if you are able to close your eyes for a second without having any physical discomfort, I'm going to take you through a little activity. I'm going to throw out a couple of identities. And I want you to reflect on the first thought that comes to your mind as I say these identities. And I ask you to close your eyes just so that you can't see any facial expressions. Men, Dallas Cowboys fans, people of African descent, people who identify as LGBTQ, people who are vertically challenged, people who wear glasses, people from the North, people from the West Coast, people of Muslim descent, women. If you did not have a negative thought about any one of those groups, hopefully it wasn't about the Dallas Cowboys, then you are ready for sainthood. Because we all, every single one of us, have biases. And so this is a non-judgment zone because I teach this stuff all the time, and I personally have biases. I am biased against people who are not Dallas Cowboys fans, particularly if they root for that team in DC. The important piece of this is to be aware of our biases. And when we are aware of them, we are able to better address them and combat them. And I take people through this activity. Oftentimes I will ask students to write it down. And when we did this activity one time with a group of students that got into a little bit of trouble, that organization shall remain nameless, but they were in trouble. And so they had to spend 2.5 hours with me. And I took them, ooh, will we? So I took them through this activity, and one of the young men, about 5 seconds in, slammed his pencil down. And I was like, I walked over to him and I was like, did you break your pencil? Like what? And he was like, no, I just don't like this. And I was like, okay. And so I said, well, just hang tight until we finish the activity and then we'll talk about it at the end. I was not expecting the student at all to debrief what he was feeling at the time. And he was the first one to raise his hand because I asked people, how did you feel about this activity? And he said, I am a messed up person. And I said, why is that? And he said, because anybody who identified differently than me, I had nothing positive to say, or I had nothing to say. So if they were not white, if I read anything that wasn't pertaining to a white man who was Christian and straight, either I had something negative to say or I didn't have anything at all to say. And I stopped him and I said, that doesn't make you a terrible person. That just made you a very self-aware person. And I applaud you for that. Because a lot of us don't even get to that point ever in our lives. And then I told him, you know, I was done for the evening. I could quit my job because I had achieved everything that I needed to achieve.
That's right.
But that was a very eye-opening experience for him, and it was a very eye-opening experience for a lot of the people in the room. What that young man did not know was he did know people who identify differently. He just did not know that. He did not know that his friend across the room identified as LGBTQ because he was not out. But he had in fact engaged with people on a daily basis that were different. He just didn't know it. And so that activity is one of my favorites because, and some people walk away and they're just like, oh my goodness, no, you're not terrible. Like I said, we all have our biases. Bias just means preference. And the way our minds work, about 99% of what this thing up here does is totally unconscious. It has so much information that it has to process minute by minute that it just automatically helps itself out by creating shortcuts. And so these shortcuts that happen in our brains are usually messages or information that we have received about people, places, or things. And so those messages can be in the form of what we see in the news, what we hear in the media, things that our family members have said to us, depending on where you've grown up. You know, Dallas Cowboys fans, people just don't like Dallas Cowboys fans. And I use these examples not to make light of, but just to show truly at the most minuscule thing, we have preferences: hot dogs, hamburgers, barbecue potato chips, regular potato chips, ridges with potato chips in them, or not. Maybe I shouldn't have this conversation before. But we all have our preferences and our biases. And we often hear that word stereotype. And stereotypes can be good and they can be bad. But that is what is happening in our minds. That's the type of information that we are receiving and the type of information that our minds are processing. And we, in terms of people, the information that our mind and the categories that our mind puts people into can be based on what we see immediately: race, what we assume as gender, weight, height, and these schemas or shortcuts impact and influence how we treat other people. And so you have these mental schemas or these stereotypes that happen, this implicit bias that happens. And that is when you have microaggressions. So microaggressions are the manifestations of those things that happen in our mind. So we have a thought about a person that we see, and we automatically, in our minds, the category that has occurred in our mind, we place them and we treat them in a way in which we're used to engaging with them or not. For that young man, he felt that he had never engaged with anyone in a positive manner or at all. And so everything that he knew in his mind, the schemas and the stereotypes that were created in his mind, came from what he was told, came from social media, came from the news, came from the circle that he engaged with. So implicit bias, if you want a hardcore definition, are the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes, whether they be good or bad, about certain groups of people. These are data points in our brains that we've acquired over time, and based on experiences, either personal experiences that we've had with people, or what we hear or what we see. Again, based on physical appearance or other aspects of identity such as gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, age. And the ideas, the schemas, the stereotypes that we have impact how we engage. So let's talk about implicit versus explicit bias. Implicit bias occurs when we make decisions or we behave in a way unconsciously that's influenced by our pre-existing beliefs about people. We often don't know that these things exist, but our behavior is a direct result of that. Explicit bias is when we are totally aware of the biases that we have, and we purposefully and intentionally behave a certain way towards a person or a group of people because of what we think about them. So when I say on Sundays, I'm terrible. I am a diehard Cowboys fan, and I am relentless, and I am so mean and evil. This is the place to repent for the way towards people who identify differently from Cowboys fans. There are people in our society, in our world, who intentionally treat people differently because of the way that they identify, because of those stereotypes. So implicit, well-intentioned, well-meaning people who misstep, who make missteps. And then the explicit bias is very intentional and sometimes very mean-spirited. So when we talk about the connection between bias and behavior and speech, we're talking about the microaggressions. You want to come up and talk about microaggressions because you know that language, and that is really good. When I started doing these workshops on campus, one of the first ones that I did a couple years ago, because these types of trainings are new, as you can imagine, and wrought with, I don't want to say controversy, but people from different sides of the conversation who don't feel that this information is necessary, and that conversations like this are very divisive. And I would say that education is very important. One, because a lot of people who are not informed don't always know that they're making these missteps. And I'll talk to you in a few minutes about some very, very concrete ways in which people who were very well intended misstepped. And I'll even give some examples of when I have misstepped. It's not divisive. It is only divisive when you don't want to know, when you want to not have the information, when you choose to operate in the same way that you have. And it's a way of thinking, right? I remember growing up, my grandmother used to tell me, Tammy, you never talk about religion. You never talk about politics. You never talk about money. You never talk about sex. She would be shocked, and if she's looking down at me, she knows that I do this every day. I talk about all of these conversations every single day for a living. But when we talk about training and why it's important, I always say that having these types of conversations are important because in our everyday lives, I'll give you an example. In my everyday life, I am involved in policy making and policy making conversations. And if you are in a position where if you're making policy, if you are hiring people, if you are in charge of a congregation, if you are in any type of position where you are managing people and making decisions about people's well-being, if you are not fully aware of your own biases, those things can sneak up. Last week, I had a training with the Student Judicial Council and the Executive Committee. And on our campus, the Executive Committee is like the head of the student body. And so they make decisions about students who are, who have allegedly lied, cheated, or stolen something. And the SJC, they make decisions about students who have alcohol violations or whatever the case may be. We know even on our campus, there are pockets of groups that have different stereotypes. So I had to talk to them about when a student comes to you and they have allegedly done whatever the case may be, if you don't realize that you have an issue with women, if you don't realize that you have an issue with frat boys, if you realize that you don't have an issue with lacrosse players or people of color, international students, those students don't stand a chance if they are sitting before you and you have these preconceived notions about them. Because you have in your mind already gone to that shortcut in your mind based on what you think, and you've already started to judge. And so it's always interesting. This definitely impacts gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, but it impacts so many other aspects. Anytime we engage with a person, we see someone we have automatically figured out in our minds something about them. I know when I walked up, y'all probably thought that I was going to be someone else, and I wasn't. And so you're like, well, who is this little short brown woman? So the word microaggression was created by Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s. And he was a professor at Harvard University. And he was the first one to coin that term microaggression. And when he talked about microaggressions, it was, as you can imagine, it was 1970. It was geared towards the slights that people were making towards Black people. He was looking specifically at the racism at that time that Black people were experiencing. Because of his scholarship and the group that he was focusing on, his research was pretty much nullified. They discredited him because of that. So a few years later, Dr. Mary Rowe in 1973 came behind him, and she coined the term micro inequities to identify the slights and discriminatory behavior towards women, people who were other abled, and other underrepresented religious populations and socially marginalized groups. Micro inequities, as Dr. Rose said, it's a part of work life, it's a part of education, it's a part of who we are. And she says that small events, which are often ephemeral and hard to prove, events which are covert, often unintentional, and frequently unrecognizable by the perpetrator. So Dr. Daryl Wing Sue in 2010 expanded the definition of microaggressions and micro inequities even more. And he says, and this is a long definition, everyday verbal and nonverbal and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional. So he expands it. He's like, even if it's well-meaning, it still counts as a microaggression. which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based upon their marginalized group membership. Microaggressions may be based on socioeconomic status, disability, gender expression or identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. So Dr. Sue came in and he said, we're just gonna include all of it. If you are not kind to people, it's a microaggression. And there are 3 specific types of microaggressions. And Tuck, if you would like, I can create a cheat sheet that I can send to you so that you can, yes. So you won't have to worry about taking copious notes. I have all of this stuff. I can do a 1-pager for you. The first one is a micro assault. And when I talk about this and I do these types of workshops, people are like, that doesn't sound very micro to me. Micro assaults are the intentional verbal or nonverbal attacks, which are meant to hurt people. This is your textbook, drawn a swastika. This is calling someone outside of their name, a derogatory term, a slur, based on sexual identity or race, or, and we've all heard them, right? Those ugly words that we have either been called before or have heard people call people of other identities, those mean nasty things. When you're on the receiving end of it, you know that was mean and hateful and it was meant to hurt, right? So that is the very textbook, hanging of a noose. That is the, defacing of flags during Pride Week. We've seen kind of a little bit of all of those types of things. So those are the intentional, that's the explicit, that's the, you belong to this identity group and therefore I don't like you and I want you to know it. So I'm gonna talk to you like you're not human, I'm gonna consider you not human, and I'm just gonna be mean. Micro insults, that's a little different. These are behavioral or verbal comments that convey rudeness, insensitivity, and demean a person's identity or racial heritage. And some examples of that would be when women grab their purses, whenever a male of color comes around or a person of color gets in the elevator and everybody kind of moves to the back and away from them. That's telling a person of color that they are articulate. And that is when a female doctor is assumed to be a nurse. And so, all the stories I can tell you. One in particular, so I don't know if you've ever heard me talk about this, but we had a student who became very intoxicated and thought that she had superhuman abilities. And so she ended up in the hospital in Roanoke. And of course, these things never happen at a reasonable hour, right? It's middle of the night. And so she came from a very religious family. And so when her mother, I don't know if her mother actually knew why she was in the hospital, but she called her mom. She was like, yeah, I'm in the hospital, whatever. So the mom calls for the hospital chaplain to come and check on her. And I had gone to get some coffee. And I came back in and the chaplain was there in the emergency room pod. And he looked at me and he says, oh, she said that the dean was here. You must be his wife. It's so nice to meet you. And so I smiled. And before I could say anything, and I won't say exactly what she said because we are in the house of God, but she said, she's nobody's wife. She's the dean, and I won't finish the rest. And he was very apologetic. He was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I said, well, she's right. I'm no one's wife. I'm very single. I am the dean. And so she's still fussing. I don't know why you think girls can't be deans. But in his mind, in the way that he was raised on the male model of leadership. That old antiquated model that men are leaders, that men are in positions of power. And to think that, you might want to sit over here.
No, he was joking.
I know, but the way you looked at him, you might be in trouble.
Was that a microaggression?
That might have been a micro assault. You know, it just automatically assumed that that I couldn't be a leader. When you look at research and what we know in society and what has been the example, men have tended to take that normative role of being a leader, and that we know that that's not the case, thankfully, in so many ways that we have moved away from that. But in many societies, that's still very much true. And so he assumed, based on what he knew, those stereotypes, those shortcuts that his brain made, the second that he saw me, that I was not a leader, that I had to be the wife of the leader. And so when we think about gender identity, when we think about gender norms, that's another way that we start to categorize and isolate and put people into categories. We assume that women have these roles. And I have friends that are men who are nurses, and they get it all the time. They walk in and they get promoted immediately. They're the doctor, and that is not the case. We do that in terms of how we think about roles in the home. That certain chores are for women and certain chores are for men. I've known some women who can cut grass with the best of them. You know, my father washed dishes and cooked, God rest his soul. He was a much better cook than my mother. And so, you know, we have to get out of those societal assumptions. But those are micro insults. The third is a micro invalidation. And these are characterized by communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person from a marginalized group. This often, examples of this, you know, friends of mine who are international or of international descent, but born in the United States, they get this all the time. So if a person is Asian or of Asian descent, people will ask them where they're from. And if they say Roanoke, Virginia, people are like, oh, where are you really from? It's like, I'm from Roanoke, Virginia. And I just tell you that. Because people's expectation is that they're gonna say that they are from somewhere where they're not. And that is a way that we often other people of various racial identity groups. Or people who say, I can't be racist or homophobic because some of my best friends are Black, Asian, or gay. My favorite is, I don't see color, I just see people. And people say that a lot. Again, very well intentioned, right? Not meaning to hurt, not meaning to be offensive in any way. Essentially what the person is saying is, I see you as a person and I will not treat you differently because of the way that you identify. But that is a way of taking away a person's identity when you don't value a person because of what they bring to the table. If you don't value them as a woman, as a male, as a member of the LGBTQ community, don't value you. I want you to see my color. I want you to see that I am a person of African descent. I want you to know the history, the legacy of what made me who I am as a person, especially within the country, because I think that my identity, one of my identities as a Black person in the United States, born in 1972. Yes,
So I would say that's the difference between tolerating
and accepting.
and, and
And celebrating.
welcoming.
Yes,
That
absolutely.
we welcome because we celebrate and we see the value in
Yes.
diversity rather than I tolerate
Yes.
diversity.
I hate that word when it comes to, can I say hate in the church? I dislike strongly.
Well, we-
I strongly dislike that language when it comes to any type of identity.
Hate in the sense that you turn away from
I
it.
turn away from it. I flee
Yeah.
from it. Yes, because it essentially, what I just said, it's like, I'm putting up with you. If I tolerate you, I put up with you because I absolutely have to, and it's not my choice. This is either forced on me by whatever situation we're in
I
together.
recognize your rights.
Yes.
Mhm.
When you talk about celebrating and you talk about inclusivity, you were talking about everyone having a seat at the table and a voice. So when we talk about diversity, and this is one of my favorite quotes.
And a plate.
Mhm.
And a plate with
And a
food on
plate
it.
with food on it, yes. When you talk about diversity, you're talking about counting, right? You're talking about who gets into what group, who identifies in what group. When you talk about inclusion, you're talking about making sure, not that you're counting the people, but you make sure that all the people count. So you make sure that they have a seat, a voice. We make sure that our policies, again, when we talk about policies and procedures and the ways in which we operate, whether it's in business, whether it's in the church, in whatever way we operate, that all the voices are represented, and that if we have to continue to amend policies, then our policies were not inclusive in the first place. And so it's a good thing that we have to go back and check our policies, but that is a way in which sometimes those voices are left out. So if you say that certain people are the leaders and you don't have the marginalized voices at the table, you're not going to have those inclusive policies all the time, because we see things from our own lens, right? We see things from our own perspective, and we tend to think that the way we see the world is the right way, and that's not the case. So yes, when you're talking about welcoming people, you are making sure that everyone is included in the conversation, and that the ways in which you operate are not exclusive, and that everyone has access, and that there are no barriers from people being able to participate.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just curious. There was a very popular book out a few years ago called Blink. And and it is, I guess his premise was, you'll be amazing how right you are in instantly judging a situation. And it didn't focus so much on people, but situations. But isn't that second, when you're facing something just filled with all these preconceived notions?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for you to realize as soon as it happens. I'll give you another example of when these things happen and how important it is to be self-aware. Because remember, I said at the beginning, we all have these biases, right? We all have these preconceived notions. But just like that young man said, oh my goodness, that moment, that epiphany where he was like, well, this is not okay. That is what happens to us when we become self-aware, when we have been educated. And it's almost like you can say something, and the second it rolls out of your mouth, you're like, ooh, yeah, that didn't sound right to me. So I can only imagine how it landed on another person. Again, the person that teaches this, right? I have a friend who is Jewish. I saw her on campus. We hadn't seen each other in a while. Tammy, how are things going over in your world? I said, oh my goodness. Oh, it's so busy. How are things going over in your camp?
Oh, yeah.
The minute I said it, and I looked at her and I said, oh my goodness. And she says, what? And I was like, I'm so sorry. She was like, what about what? And then I said what I just said. And then she played it back in her head and she was like, oh, I didn't even think that at first, but immediately for me, it was like what I just said could have been so offensive. It took her a minute to, I don't know why it took her a minute to catch on, but I'm glad it did. And I apologized immediately. And she knew that I wasn't coming from a bad place. Her mind didn't immediately go there, but mine did. And so when you educate yourself enough about identity groups, you know that sometimes you say things. Jay catches me all the time because I said something the other day about call me on, and he made a joke out of it, and I was like, Jay, come on now. But I said something about him getting something out the closet, and he said, you're really going to tell a gay man to come out of the closet? And I was like, I didn't mean it like that, but yes, I understand where you're coming from on that, but because he was in the closet doing something, I was like, Jay, come out of the closet and talk. And he was like,
But he took it like a man.
oh, microaggression. And so, I mean, and again, oftentimes we say and do things, we're never really ill-intended, except for the micro assaults. And when it happens, and how do you recover from that, right? Because oftentimes people will say, well, I didn't intentionally mean to hurt you. Well, that doesn't mean that it didn't hurt. If I had on my stilettos, I don't have them on today, but if I walked up, I stepped on Melissa's toe, even if I didn't mean to step on her toe, it will hurt like the dickens. And I can apologize all day long and say, I'm sorry, I did not mean to step on your toe. That was totally an accident. She's gonna feel that for a couple of days, especially if I hit that toe the right way. And so Dr. Daryl Wing Sue says that when we are the perpetrators of microaggressions, and the person who is on the receiving end, for them, that could be the 15th time that thing happened, that comment was made, or that they were slighted or overlooked, or whatever the case may be. That could have been the 15th time that day, and they had just had enough. Dr. Daryl Wing Sue says that microaggressions are like death by 1,000 paper cuts, or maybe he said 10,000 paper cuts, which is, ooh, that's even worse. But you know, a paper cut is small. They hurt. They are awful. You know, and that's what a microaggression does. And so when we exclude people, when we make comments, when we make judgments, when we make assumptions towards a group of people, an identity or a person based on their identity, that is essentially what we're doing. We might be that 9,999 paper cut that they've had that day. And it just continues to hurt. And there is a lot of harm that goes along with these microaggressions. When you talk to people who are from marginalized identity groups, they will say that the level of depression, the level of anxiety, the amount of work that they have to do to try to recover from other people's missteps. And I'll say missteps because, again, the majority of these things are missteps. They're not done and meant to hurt.
But they do.
But they do.
And you don't forget.
You don't forget. And I think for the church, in my church, we call it church hurt. That church hurt is often the worst, right? Because you expect for the people in the church to be
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. I always tell people when someone says, oh, they're a mean Christian, I'm like, the two shouldn't go together, but yes, they do. And so we have this expectation of people in the church to behave differently and to engage differently with people. And that's not always the case. So when people are hurt by folks in the church, that stings a little bit deeper.
20 years at WNL. Okay, were you always in this category of work?
No, I consider myself a student affairs generalist.
Okay.
I have done diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have done residential life. I have done student conduct. I have done, did I say housing and res life conduct? I've done first year experience, sophomore year experience, senior year experience. Never did junior year experience. That
And they
might be
missed you.
something.
I was just curious over the 20 years. Because we're up here and doing a good job at, are we getting better or is it getting worse? As far as this, I mean, I'm just curious.
Let's just say that I probably will always have job security.
Yeah.
I think in some ways,
Are we paring it down to smaller issues, but there seems like so much anger.
yeah, I would say in some ways we've gotten better. I think the conversation and the ability to have these dialogues in most places, although there are some people who are trying to keep us from having these conversations and don't like critical race theory, all those types of things. So I think the education behind this, you know, we now have students that are coming to campus and they know what to call something.
Yeah.
They know what to call it and they know that it's not right. So I think in some ways we're getting better because the education is out there. I think the thing that is getting worse, in my opinion, is social media and the media in general, awful in perpetrating some of and perpetuating some of these ills. I tell the students all the time, I dislike strongly social media because it is an opportunity for people to be unkind in an anonymous way. And so that's oftentimes when you have those micro assaults, those things where you call a gay person that when you use this word to describe someone of a different group, it is often done anonymously. It's often done by cowards. It's done in groups.
Or irresponsibly too.
Irresponsibly, because people don't want to be identified, right? So they'll hang the noose at the dark of night. They'll put the swastika out on the playground when nobody's watching. They'll, write the F word on a student's whiteboard in the middle of the night, and the student wakes up and that word is, So those are the types of things that they're able to do. January 6th. A lot of people didn't think that they were going to be identified. I don't know how, because all the cameras and everything, but because they were in these big groups, it's like, there's no way you'll be able to identify me. Surprise. So I think in some ways things are getting better. But when you have people in seats of power that are not self-aware or very intentional about their biases, and they make policies based on those things, it's getting worse.
Well, one thing that maybe I've noticed in myself is that, when my implicit bias is called out, because more and more of my kids are willing to call out my implicit bias, or whatever it is. I experienced this sort of reaction. Well, I didn't mean it, so don't blame me, or I get reactive. And
just take it.
And as that's happening, I think more, a lot of us we just think of it as an idiom, or as just something that we've always said. And as that gets called, we have this experience of fragility, right? And and I'm speaking about myself, probably largely as a straight white man, think why is everybody on my case? And
What did you do?
and that there's anger that comes out of that. And in terms of reactivity and not wanting to change the way I've always done it.
Yep.
Or said it.
Yeah, even I've had to change my language, right? I would always say things, if I was gonna go off campus, I'm running for the border, like I'm running for
Oh,
the
yeah,
exterior
yeah.
of campus. Had to change that.
Uh,
But I thought it was okay, right? Because the Taco Bell commercial we talked
That's
about running
right.
towards the border, and sometimes I'm just like, ooh, all the things that we all
When you're
have
not eating
seen.
right, I just went off the reservation, it's like, stop.
Yes, yes,
know?
yes, all the things that we say every day that has been a part of, that's cliche-ish and catchy and all of those.
And now
things.
people are willing to maybe call us on it.
People and the
And
students
whereas before they would just
that let it go.
let it go.
my
And we
students-
think, well, why don't they just let it go?
Because we can't, because it is.
I know,
so
but that's where the
offensive and
anger,
so-
I think that's why the anger is mounting.
Yeah, and then when we get caught on our own stuff, and most people, again, when they call you on it, they're not coming from a place.
Right.
Most people know that you meant no ill intent.
Right.
And so they're coming from a place of grace, but
But we
you're
can
just
still be
like,
reactive.
yeah, you gotta own it and you gotta correct it, because again, that was a warning for you. That was someone that was kind enough to say, "Ooh, that's not okay." Because the next person that you encounter and you say that to might not be quite as
One thing that worries me is the word equity.
kind. Okay,
What I don't want it to become is reverse discrimination,
okay,
because to me, this is tragedy. Racism in response to racism.
mhm,
And we're talking about equal outcomes versus equality for opportunity, I think. And I would prefer to think of it as equality for opportunity rather than equal outcomes.
so I'm gonna give you an example, and I wish I had done the technology when we talk about equality and equity.
Oh, you're gonna be back, don't worry.
Bless your heart. Thank you. I'll come back. When we talk about equality, that means if we all wanted to look out that window and we all had a problem looking out that window, everybody would get this chair. That's equal. That makes us all equal because we all have access to the same resources. But I'm 5'1". Tuck is not. So if I were given this chair, I'm still not gonna be able to see out that window. Tuck is gonna be able to see really, really well out that window because he's much taller than me. So what I need in order to have the same ability to see as Tuck is, I need something that's much taller. That's when you get into equity.
I would make it available, for everyone who's 5'1", I'd give them a higher chair.
Exactly, and that's
That
the
way they can
difference.
all see out the window.
Absolutely, and that's the difference between equity and equality.
But when we start talking about property values or, access to higher education or things like that,
Mhm.
then equity has,
It's a slippery
Has
slope, is what I'm
consequence.
worried about.
well, is that a slippery slope?
If it becomes racism in response to racism, this becomes a tragedy for a country that has suffered so greatly from this plague,
Well,
which
I
is
think-
called racism.
I think we also have to think about the term of racism, right? Racism comes with power, and marginalized groups will never be able to have dominant
Here's another problem.
power. Okay.
Like I said, you'll be back.
So important to true diversity is equity. It's so important to successful inclusivity is equity. In order to be in those places, you need to be prepared to be there. In
Okay.
order to really feel like you're a part of the team.
Right.
You wouldn't want to propel someone to a place where they're not prepared to to participate, because the inevitable result is that they feel, they don't feel like they're a part.
But why would we assume that someone is not prepared?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about medicine or the law or science, you have to be prepared to participate intelligently.
Yes. So you're saying that we need qualified Black doctors?
Certainly.
All doctors should be qualified.
All doctors should
We
be
need qualified
absolutely.
people. Here's another thing I want to throw out for the record.
Okay, throw it on out.
You know,
there.
recently, the government has announced that everyone from age, or suggested everyone from age, I think, 8 through 65 should be examined for anxiety. The world, we're an anxious people.
Mhm. I would
But after
agree.
65,
Not too much of a problem there.
Thomas Sowell, the soft bigotry of low expectations.
I just commend you for what you're doing. It's an extraordinarily difficult task.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I will say, you know, when we have these expectations, again, I walk into a room and people automatically make assumptions about me because of what they immediately see. The average CEO of any Fortune 500 company is 5 inches taller than the average American. I'm 5'5" in a good pair of stilettos. So I am the antithesis of everything that they say about a leader. So I know that when I walk into a room, I have to come in a different kind of way because people see me as Black, they see me as a woman, they see me as vertically challenged. And so people automatically assume certain things about me. They assume. One of the jobs that I had prior to this was having a conversation with a colleague. And she said something about being from middle class and was talking to me like I wouldn't understand what that's like. And I said, oh, okay, well, you're making assumptions about me. First of all, I went to a Catholic school. I went to private school. I had both parents in the household. Both of them were professionals. And then we started talking, she was talking about her debutante ball. And I said, yeah, I had one of those when I was 16 too. And she looked at me and she was like, what? I said, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I do know about high society. I know about all of these things. Don't assume because of what the stereotypes that you have about certain people that I fit into that, because I don't. If I can finish this little book report, I will be part of the 2% of people who have PhDs.
The book report.
The little book report that I'm in the process of writing. And I'm even in a smaller club of Black women who have PhDs. So when I walk into a room, people are gonna automatically assume certain things, that I'm not qualified, that I shouldn't be there. But after almost 50 years, I've learned how to kind of pull a seat up at the table if I'm not invited. I just welcome myself.
Just think, if you're a short man, what are you faced with?
You have privilege.
You're faced
say
with,
something.
You still have privilege.
you're
because-
faced with being called, having a Napoleon complex.
But you will often, even as a man, still be invited in places that I won't be invited, even with your height.
So almost Dr. Futrell.
Almost.
Thank you very much for this today. Thank you for allowing us to post this on our, this recording.
You're
Um,
welcome.
And we look forward to
I hope
having
you
you
got all
back
the
for
slides.
additional presentations.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
Thank
Oh, yeah.
Janet and Greg.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. And then the next time.